Tante, my name is Taylor Henderson and I am from the Driftpile Cree Nation. Today we will be touring Kent Monkman's exhibition called Shame and Prejudice. Kent Monkman is an artist from the Fisher River Cree Nation in Treaty 5 territory, now known as Manitoba, but now lives in Toronto. This exhibition is in perspective of Mischief Eagle Testicle, Kent Monkman's two-spirit alter ego.
Gala Kessler, Nugo Jasame, Gayut Klinlach, Klautzis, Mumtagila, Klutz, Quatzala, Naklach, Klutz, Awikinu. Greetings, my name is Aramis Henyus, but my ancestral name is Jasame, and I'm 18 years old. This is my third year in the Native Youth Program. And the first stop I'll be taking you through today is called the Starvation exhibit.
Hi, my name is Cole Bach. I am a grade 10 student from the Tsawwassen Nation, and the piece I chose to show you today is entitled The Bears of the Confederation.
Hello, my name is Mackenzie Fung, and I'm a grade 12 Haida student at King George Secondary School. Today, I'm going to be taking you through two pieces of Kent Monkman's exhibit, Shame and Prejudice.
The first piece I chose to show you today is entitled The Bears of the Confederation. I chose this piece because at first sight it intrigued me with the men engaging in intercourse with the bears. Before this exhibit, I hadn't experienced art like this before, as most of Western culture thinks of sexuality as taboo. Looking deeper into this, you'll see the red accents in this piece, including Mischief's praying hands, which are a butt plug in display in another part of the exhibit. To some, this piece may seem crude or insulting, which reiterates my point on the westernized view of sexuality versus the way Indigenous people viewed it. The white lens taught me that sexuality was a dirty thing and something to be kept secret, instead of a beautiful thing, a part of life and part of the human experience. The Western view taught me that sex was to make life and not a part of life. The opportunity to view sexuality from an Indigenous perspective was taken from me. In my view, this piece is both reclaiming the land and reclaiming sexuality. Thank you. We will now move on to the next tour.
This piece is called the Nativity Scene. It is basically the birth of mischief. If you've noticed, all three of the mannequins have the same face, and this is because when Kent went to the Natural History Museum, all mannequins, regardless of sex, nation, or gender, had the same face, and he did this as an ironic twist on how Indigenous people are perceived in museums. This really resonated with me because it really shows the impacts that colonization has had on Indigenous communities by depicting the poor living conditions on reserves. It hurts me to know that many of my Indigenous brothers and sisters live in third world conditions, and the government isn't doing anything about it, despite several attempts by Indigenous people to bring these issues to light. These issues include no clean drinking water, boil water advisories, high-priced commodities, no access to services, which can all be seen in this exhibit. I chose this piece because of the attention to detail, more specifically with the beaded Blackhawks logo. If you look closer, you might be able to see a penis hidden within it. In my opinion, this was a humorous take on cultural appropriation within sports teams, and more specifically with their logos. In the background, you might recognize a scene from The Scream. In my opinion, this is foreshadowing the baby's future in residential schools. Thank you.
This right here is the Starvation exhibit. In front of me is the Starvation table, and behind me is a painting called The Iron Horse. Inspiration from this exhibit comes from Giovanni Domenico Tiepolo's 1773 painting called The Procession of the Trojan Horse into Troy. The table and the painting are illustrating the same message as here on the table. This end clearly shows off richness, and it's basically shouting prosperity. But then you move further down the table and you notice a change. It deteriorates. And then eventually you reach the end, and in Kent Monkman's own words, the starvation plates, which clearly poses a difference to the far end of the table. There are many ways this can be interpreted, but the way I interpret this illustration is, in almost every trade from first contact with the settlers, Indigenous people were always getting the bad end of the deal, whether that was in the form of treaties and land rights or food distribution. Modern forms of this ordeal, in my opinion, would be Indigenous communities which, as of right now, a huge portion are under third world conditions, and even 61 Indigenous communities in Canada are still under boil water advisories. So if you take a closer look at the starvation plates, you can see each one printed with a photo that tells a significant story in Canadian history. The key pictures decorated on the plates are definitely the ones with the mountain of buffalo skulls.
Now, why these pictures are so important is because in the proposal of the railway, which at the time was considered by the Canadian government to be a stepping stone in history, many Canadians stood by those claims but never realized what it meant for Plains Indigenous people. When it was proposed, it was promised to bring them wealth, richness, and progress, but in turn caused the mass murder of their main food supply, which evidence shows that's what's seen here on the plates of all the buffalo skulls. Now, the photo on this plate is actually a picture of Kent Monkman's painting called The Daddies, which is actually a play on the Fathers of Confederation, and that's what this photo is referring to. And Sir John A. Macdonald, acting as both Prime Minister and Minister of Indian Affairs, bragged in Parliament that he was keeping the Indigenous population on the verge of starvation when he was questioned on his investment to build the railway. When the proposition on the railway wasn't persuading the Plains Indigenous people, both Chief Big Bear and Chief Poundmaker were incarcerated and starved to submission, where they were forced to sign the treaties which granted the government access to proceed with the railway. But now we move on to the painting behind the table, the Iron Horse. As mentioned before, this has taken a play on the procession of the Trojan horse. The painting and even the proposal of the railway can be compared to each other, as each have such similar propositions with impactful catastrophes following afterward. I believe this was a conscious choice on behalf of Kent Monkman. Why I believe so is even after the railway was built, the Plains Indigenous people never got what they were promised. John A. Macdonald was very clear what his intent was when the railway was built. And after the fact, the railway was used as a weapon to slaughter the buffalo with malicious intent to starve the Indigenous people. And now we move on to the comparison. The famous story of the Trojan horse, which many of us today have either been referenced to or heard the story. The Trojan horse was a subterfuge used against the Trojans that gave the illusion that this giant wooden horse was a truce. Troy had been convinced it was a victory trophy, believing that they had just won the war. But instead, later in the night, a force of men hidden inside the horse would hop out and slaughter the people of Troy. The term Trojan horse in modern vocabulary is a metaphor referencing the trickery or stratagem which is seen clearly with the proposal of the railway. This is why I believe Kent Monkman chose this form of storytelling in this specific art piece. Now, talking about the term Iron Horse, the title of the painting. The Iron Horse is a term said to have been coined by the indigenous people of North America in the early 1800s when they first witnessed a steam locomotive. And why I decided to choose this art piece is because I am a very passionate advocate when it comes to indigenous history and mistreatment from the Canadian government. Many Canadians are misinformed as the truth is often hidden from the public.
That concludes my section of the tour, and I would like to pass it over to the next guide.
The Scream. Not the one by Edvard Munch that you're all likely familiar with. No, that one's on the other side of the globe. This one, if you take a look over here, depicts a scene of the days only mere decades ago where Indigenous children were ripped from their homes by the Canadian government in tandem with the church to bring these kids to the Indian residential schools. This piece radiates horror, fear, and raw, visceral emotion. This piece is the centerpiece of its chapter, if not the entire exhibit, taking up an entire wall with its bright colors. And I chose this piece because it spoke to me. This is the only piece in the entire exhibit that mischief is not inserted in, nor is there any comedic, albeit bitter, irony painted onto this canvas. Just a scene of children being kidnapped and brutalized, families being ripped apart, and the feeling of sheer and utter helplessness. And these kids, children, barely old enough for kindergarten, were stolen en masse from their homes. These families, these fathers, these grandparents, these mothers never got to see their babies again. Their sons and daughters indoctrinated into hating who they were and where they came from. Others lost to fires, freezing disease. More still, lost the battle to the hate and to the pain inside of them. And in the end, paid the ultimate price to escape it, their own life. And with a mortality rate of 40 to 60%, being taken was all but a death sentence. And those lost kids are depicted here on either side of me. These cradle boards were given to Monkman to use in this exhibit by the museums that held them. But you'll see some are missing, replaced with simple chalk outlines of where a cradle board might have once stood. These outlines can mean one of many things. You might interpret them like the chalk outline of a body at a crime scene. You might see them more like the shape of a coffin. To me, I see them as the same shape as the blank tombstones that marked each unmarked grave at each of those schools' cemeteries. But no matter how you see them, no matter how you interpret it, they all mean the same thing. Those children who once laid on these, that once slept on these boards, never came home. And it hurts me to know that this has happened to my family and to the family of so many others. Thank you.